you look at Tolkien, and at the end of the books, Sauron has been defeated, Aragorn is king, and Tolkien just says that he ruled wisely and well for 500 years or whatever. And it's easy to type, he ruled wisely and well. But then you start asking yourself, what does that constitute, ruling wisely and well? I mean, what was his tax policy? How did the economy function?
Stop right there, criminal scum. Have you paid your taxes? No? Well, it's off to the darkest, dankest dungeon in Stormvale with you. Look at the meat on those bones. My Lord Godric's gonna work wonders grafting you. Hang on. What? You didn't know that the economy works on a might makes right basis of absorbing the intangible essence of your slain adversaries? What do you mean you didn't know how Marika levied her taxes? She's in the last tax collector to the lands between only 300 years ago? Cravenness tarnished never ceases to amaze me. But alright, I'll indulge you in this lifetime. The economy of the lands between. With George R.R. Martin himself laying the foundations of Elden Ring, the seeds were sown for From Software's most world-building rich game yet. But what many players miss out is Elden Ring's rather complex economy. It's hardly the main focus of the game, but it is nonetheless there. And Elden Ring is full of impressive sights after all, with towering castles, grand lifts, paved roads, and multiple standing armies. How could all of these be paid for if not through some kind of complex economic system and taxation? But what would an economy look like in a game as esoteric as Elden Ring? Well, there's not one single way that Marika could have raised her taxes. Instead, it's a hodgepodge of intertwined factors that create a surprisingly complex economic system, one that was eventually crushed by the weight of its own entropy. Where is the economic activity in the lands between? Unlike more immersion-oriented games like Skyrim, there aren't as many indicators of economic activity in Elden Ring that we can easily pick out. But just because we don't have NPC routines to follow and taverns to check out, doesn't mean that we can't learn a lot from the landscape. The first sign we get of real economic activity are the building works. Elden Ring's architecture is insane. Shout out to Adipalooza for their video showcasing the true scale of it. With major castles dotted around the map, it's clear that the Golden Order values works of scale and complexity, and would need the workforce to match. Obviously, much of what we see is in a state of disrepair, but before the Shattering, which is the bit that we're most interested in, these sites would be beacons of the Golden Order's influence and power. Joining these castles are the grand lifts, road networks, settlements, and churches, providing the bedrock for a civilized society. Education was present too, as Raya Lucaria shows that Elden Ring's economy was advanced enough to be able to support centres of higher learning. Same deal with the Colosseums, demonstrating a joint culture of engaging in sport and blood games in Lanedale, Limgrave, and Caelid, all three of which would have been potent sources of income. The armies of the various demigods are indicative of a developed economic system too. Troop levies mean lovely, lovely economic activity. To support the buildings and armies, there would need to be mining and quarrying. Marika's many wars needed weapons after all, so they would have been in constant demand of smithing stones, and a lot of this mineral wealth could likely have come from Caelid. It's hard to tell exactly what Caelid looked like before Malenia nuked it, but the sheer quantity of tunnels and the very rock-strewn nature of the place tells us that it probably has a lot of metal in the ground, which would have made Redmane Castle one of the richest castles in the land. It's hard to track whether the distribution of smithing stones in the current day is indicative of where it once was, but if that is the case, then we know that the mountaintops probably had the rarest, but sadly, we can't really tell who was in charge of mining them. Let's not forget the wood trade either. The lands between is dotted with various forests, mostly condensed in Limgrave and Altus, and as a major building material this would have made these areas very important trading hubs. When it comes to food, it's hard to judge. Farming doesn't seem to be happening anywhere in the lands between except for a tiny plot in Jarburg, where they grow ingredients for crafting. We do know farms were once present around the Altus Plateau though, with the northern side dominated by the diminular windmill village for milling grain. But as everything is more of a permanent autumn today, the land doesn't really seem fit to support farms anymore. So, without farming being done post-Shattering, the food supply would be reliant on more transient sources. Limgrave has plenty of sea access, and is an ideal place for fishing. Even post-shattering, there are multiple broken boats off the coast of the Weeping Peninsula that show maritime activities present. Herds of goats can be found all over, coming in regular and lemon zinger flavours, and hunting in general would undoubtedly be a vital method of getting food. We can pick all kinds of berries and fruits on our travels, and the migratory, non-permanent living status of many of Elden Ring's NPCs suggests they have to move around the world for new opportunity. Mr. Krabs himself, Blackguard Boggart, even migrates during his questline for better opportunity, upgrading from boiled prawn to boiled crab. But all this economic activity is all well and good, but the people need to get paid. So let's look at the Lands Between's closest analogue for money: runes. The role of runes. Runes are the bedrock of Elden Ring's economy, pre and post-shattering. But what are runes exactly? Well, it's not as cut and dry as it seems. According to item descriptions from a few large rune items, runes are connected to grace, which was bestowed by Marika on the inhabitants of the Lands Between. Besides the warrior-type enemies we fight along the way, runes can be found in pretty much every kind of enemy, from Miranda flowers, dogs, dragons, and even little fleshy boys on the floor. Even Graceless Tarnished have runes, which leads me to believe that when Marika lifted all their gilded cataracts, they still retained their runes somehow. While the player can use runes to barter and trade in Elden Ring, this is a post-collapse society. Just because currency works a certain way now doesn't guarantee that it always did. Take Fallout, for example. Bottle caps are the currency in that universe, but only because an apocalypse made the previous system of currency impossible to sustain. As far as I can tell, runes probably always were the main form of currency, but it's worth bearing in mind that their usage and value probably fluctuated over time. Assuming they are the legal tender, the Lands Between runs on the most crudely effective form of hypercapitalism there is: might makes right. This has some interesting implications, as it makes wealthier people literally more powerful than their poorer neighbours. One of the most effective ways to get more runes is by taking them from another living being, so you can see how things might have destabilised with time. One thing worth considering is that runes can be stored in a rough sense, as we can acquire rune items in the game, the leftover power of an individual. So, in a strange and morbid way, you can imagine people living under the Golden Order paying for things with their little wallets of dead people's power, which is kind of gross and fascinating at the same time. Like, imagine just whipping out a Lord's rune when you want to make a big purchase, like, whoa, big rune spender, who did you steal that from? Like all good capitalist societies, the flow of runes works like a pyramid. Those at the bottom are many and poor, while those at the top are few and rich. As more runes lead to more power, the strong climb the social ladder, while the weak fall down, until eventually everything will culminate at the top or the bottom. Perhaps this is what Radagon meant by the law of regression. Unless large rune hoarders spend lots or are killed to create some trickle-down runeonomics, society will begin to stagnate from a complete lack of circulating supply. We can learn from numerous item descriptions that the Grace of Gold was a reward given by the divine Marika to her subjects for their efforts, and so followed more runes. As the queen chosen by the Greater Will, Marika is not only the Golden Order's monarch, but its chief banker. It's unclear how many times Marika could bestow grace, but some descriptions highlight Marika being able to potentially grant it more than once. Grace, and its byproduct runes, reflected Marika's favour, and her giving away grace too generously would be the equivalent of stoking inflation by printing money. In her third role, aside from Queen and head of the Bank of Leyndell, Marika was also the foremost religious figure. Hers was a rule built on an economy of favour, where her blessing was so potent it could launch crusades, and that's a kind of currency that's non-fungible. If runes are both the currency of the body and soul, then we need to talk about how it effectively supplanted money in the Lands Between. Show me the money. When doing research for this video, I was surprised to learn that there are no coins found in the Lands Between. For a while I was certain that there must have been coins at some point in the Lands Between's history, until I looked at the description of the gold coin from Dark Souls. Even coins of great value in the world of men have little value in Lordran, where the accepted currency is souls. Those who dream of returning to the outside world are fond of carrying these around. While the description has no bearing on Elden Ring's lore, it is indicative of Miyazaki's philosophy around currency in this kind of world, and explains why coins aren't in it. In the lands between, where economic systems are tied to devotion, worship, and power, coins would be worth nothing next to the power of a soul laid bare. Instead, cultures outside the lands between relied on coins. Signs of economic activity! Bog! In Shadow of the Erd Tree, the Horn-Sense society that Marika sent her boy to babysit used to trade with silver and gold horn tenders, literally called a currency in their item descriptions. Sadly for us, when the Bernie boy turned up to bring Marika's kind-hearted, gentle ways to the Horn-Scent, this currency somehow fell out of use. Night Rain 2 added a few coins as part of remembrance quests, and the faded iron coin description calls it an iron coin from faraway lands, used for trade. Interestingly, the double-sided coin item description mentions that it's from a former age, but not where. So it's possible that these older coins did originate in the lands between, or were once used before runes, but as we have nothing more than conjecture to go off, let's assume that it's foreign money. Night Rain's canonical status, of course, isn't clear. Personally, I do believe that Night Rain is canon to Elden Ring, but you might disagree, and that's okay. It won't blow a hole in this video. Trade in the lands between. Without the means to produce every type of good, trading is something the lands between relies upon heavily. But the way the Golden Order treats outsiders makes you wonder why anyone really bothers. We know that trade must be a thing, because all of the farms in the land are gone, yet we can find bread and cabbages on tables. The most likely culprit for these items are the ships we see drawn on the map, hardly representative of real trade, but indicative that there is a known maritime presence out there. Before the Shattering, trade was probably more common overseas, but since then, there seem to be few willing to make the journey to the impoverished land of the Golden Order. One group of traders we do know are the nomadic merchants, some of the most common NPCs in Elden Ring, and the leftover peddlers of wares that were hunted down and persecuted for their foreign religion. We know that they fell to the predations of the Flame of Frenzy, pushed into madness by their persecution at the hands of the Golden Order, and in doing so, the Golden Order lost one of its key potential trading partners. We know from the real world that trade is a vital part of any economy, and a major source of tax revenue. So the Golden Order taking offence to such a large mercantile faction likely damaged the economy considerably, stopping a solid means of getting goods from outside the lands between that were otherwise impossible to produce. In a way, this means the Golden Order put up its own trade barriers by relying on runes as a currency. As runes are tied to faith and the grace of gold, and the merchants came from a foreign land with heretical religious practices, it's possible that their persecution was inevitable. What can't be ignored is that the nomadic merchants came in the first place, so they must have smelled opportunity in Marika's kingdom. As we know, the Three Fingers reside beneath Leyndell, though whether it was there to begin with or was brought forth by imprisoned merchants isn't exactly clear, but I'm more inclined to believe the latter. Either way, it was hard for them to foster lasting trade routes in such a hostile place, and since then, the remaining merchants are the last vestiges of this attempted foray into the lands of gold. We don't even know if they initially traded in runes, but the leftover ones really don't have a choice now. Hold it right there! I'm sorry to interrupt this broadcast, but I just wanted to quickly announce that I've started a Patreon. I lost my job whilst making this video, so if there's any support you can lend me, I really appreciate that. There aren't any rewards set up just yet, but in time there will be a Discord, other things, different tiers, blah 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 blah, you know, the usual kind of thing. I know it's a classic YouTuber thing to beg for money, but trust me, I don't feel any better doing it. All that glitters is not gold. There's a golden elephant in the room, and it's cramping my impeccable style. Gold is obviously very important in Elden Ring. You don't need to be a five-head to understand that. So, the fact that it plays no part in the economy is actually quite fascinating. Gold is so plainly abundant in the lands of the Erd Tree that it's already tied up in runes and grace, so the physical object seems to be of little importance outside of associating someone with the Golden Order faction. We see the colour gold and royalty closely associated, and many of Leyndell's soldiers appear to wear it and use equipment made of it, but it isn't inherently valuable. If I'm correct in thinking, it reminds me of the Aztec attitude to gold when the Spanish found them. It was in such abundance in their society, it wasn't particularly special, but when the Spanish saw it, they were thinking, damn, how these guys just ignoring all this moolah. But then I did get that anecdote from Horrible Histories, so I don't know how accurate it is. Okay, so now that I've bored you all with Marikonomics, we can finally ask, how did Marika levy her taxes? How Marika levied taxes. If runes made up most of the Lands Between's currency, how were they taxed? No doubt, runes could have been taxed at a number of levels, with taxes on lands, profits, tolls, etc. But as none of this is measurable in the present day, we need to turn to a very obvious mechanism, one that is sitting right in front of you. By resting at a grace, when we have a finger maiden, we can channel our runes through the maiden to exchange them for levels. These runes have been collected from slain enemies and are the reason we grow in power as a character. But where are the runes actually going? The most likely answer is the Greater Will. In the time of the Erdtree Society's heyday, they may have gone through Marika too, but sensing the doom of the current world, the Greater Will resurrected the Tarnished in the hopes of starting a new age, and gave many of them the grace in order to help them achieve that end. The use of sites of grace through Elden Ring's history isn't entirely clear, but they do seem like more of a response to the shattering rather than something that existed long term. However, when faith, power and money are so wrapped up in one thing that is runes and grace, I find it hard to imagine that similar methods of exacting tribute from people below you wouldn't be available. This type of direct taxation between a worshipper on the ground and a holy institution representing a god is very reminiscent of a tax called a tithe, and a tithe forms the first pillar of Marika's tax policy. Originating in Old English, tithe means tenth, and comes from the practice of giving 1/10 of your income or produce or other commodity to a church or religious institution. Tithes have been a large part of both Christianity and Judaism, and while they aren't as common today, the world of the Middle Ages that Elden Ring often draws a lot from was pretty big on tithing. Tithes were intended to support local community projects, welfare programs, building works, and not paying a tithe could be seen as an affront to God. After all, you were freeloading off his creation, and not only would that be sacrilegious, but you were depriving your own community too. Tithing is a powerful tool in faithful societies to encourage communal spending, and in the context of Elden Ring, where the monarch, banker and head of the church are one person, it seems logical that the Greater Will's representative would be receiving runes and in exchange granting her grace as a favour. Now, I'm not a religious person myself, and I'm aware that there might be all sorts of contention around this, so if you want to lend me some more context, I'd very happily listen. Tying into this, another theme that From Software likes to play with in its games is institutional and religious corruption, and the history of religion is full of examples of well-intentioned programs being abused by people. The role of clerics in the Dark Souls series has pretty much universally been associated with deceit and cowardice, to the point that Patches has a special distaste for them. Religion in Dark Souls is engineered specifically to manipulate, and I think that a similar thing is happening here. In the modern time, after the Shattering, the runes collected by the player that get tithed during the level up process are not going to fund some community works. They are going directly towards the Greater Will as an expression of personal devotion, and in return, the Greater Will rewards the player with more strength for their journey. But this cycle is not eternal, and the Greater Will can just as soon decide that the relationship is no longer worth maintaining, and all of those tithes will come to naught. Look at Godfrey. He paid his dues, yet he got strung up like a certain Italian man I won't mention. In the context of religion and devotion though, runes make perfect sense as a way of taxing the faithful. Sacrificing a portion of their grace given by Marika, the faithful can affirm their favour with the current god, assuming that is, the god has any favour left to give. Feudal taxation. Perhaps in part because of George R.R. Martin's influence, Elden Ring is pretty clearly based around a medieval European feudal society. Each region is represented by a different demigod of Marika's, bearing the demigod's colours and banners. Before the Shattering, each one answered to Marika, the head of the Golden Order, and no doubt there would have been some taxes to pay into both the local castle and Lanedel's coffers. So how did feudal Europe's tax work? Well, like in many things, I'm no expert on medieval society, but the feudal system essentially stratified society into 4 tiers: the monarch, the lords, the knights, and the peasants. Each one provided services to another tier in return for something else. The site Medieval Genealogy sums it up best. I know, don't sound like Sir Davos, because he is a fictional character. He's an Irish man doing a Geordie accent. In post-conquest medieval England, land was not owned in the modern sense by anyone but the monarch. Instead, it was held by tenants, from lords or occasionally ladies, in return for the obligation to perform some service. This was the feudal system, with the king at the top of the ladder, his direct tenants, tenants-in-chief, beneath them, and lower still, under-tenants of various sizes, down to the peasant farmers who held a few acres in return for labouring on the land of the local lord. Also from the same source is some information on a few types of taxes that could be expected in this society. The earliest taxes in England were based on land. The first land tax, the Gelt, began in the late 10th century to raise tribute money for the Danish invaders and continued until the mid-12th century. In addition, much of the crown's income came from feudal dues of various kinds, which were, in effect, taxes on land. One example was the feudal aid, a payment by which tradition the king could demand from his tenants to finance the knighting of his eldest son or the marriage of his eldest daughter. Another was scutage, a payment made by those who held land in return for military service, but who were unable or unwilling to perform it. If we apply this to Elden Ring, we can quickly see some parallels. The various legacy dungeons cap off the zones of Elden Ring's map, and would have served as a local hub for extracting land taxes, both for the demigods and for Marika. All of the signs of economic activity we talked about earlier would be in line for taxation, and it could easily have changed according to circumstance. Whereas taxes on altars could be levied in terms of sending grain to the capital or providing religious service, Stormvale could have collected its taxes in the form of fishing halls and wood, whereas Caelid could tax mining and raise many men to its proud warrior contingents. Small enemies like soldiers are not particularly rune-rich in the lands between, so many of the fighting men we see would have likely been too poor to buy themselves out of service. Thus, being so poor, they picked up arms in defence of their respective lords and rendered their tax service in battle. What is unusual about a lot of the soldiers is that they belong to standing armies, although they probably didn't begin that way. The idea of standing armies in medieval times was almost unthinkable, and armies took considerable time and resources to muster, equip, and transport to the battle. The logistics involved meant that armies would have to dissolve back into society after conflict, making prolonged wars very difficult and costly. As many of the soldiers fighting these battles were peasant levies, it also took away from the economic output at home, and any training the lower ranks got was often on-the-fly instruction. When Marika sealed the Rune of Death, and the minds of many of the population degraded from their deathless states, the idea of true feudalism broke down, so a lot of these soldiers never went home, not realising what they were missing, eternally waging someone else's war. Carriages and war spoils. You may have seen that wonderful video by Shaggy McSwaggy, following all of the carriages in Elden Ring to see where they go, and if you haven't, you should. But beyond the curiosity of merely where they go, I want to ask why. Well, in game, they are referred to as coffins, and they apparently resemble Victorian hearses, according to a certain wiki. Inside the sealed part is presumably the body of a fallen warrior, and in the chest at the back is a piece of equipment belonging to them. Each carriage's item is relevant to the location it's found, but they're all a really weird assortment, from the esoteric St. Trina's torch and lush ruler's set, to the downright plain Morning Star and Great Axe, hardly heirlooms worth having a big procession over. Of course, the carriages pulled by trolls are only some of the ones found in game, as we can find many by an old lift at Altus Plateau. Ransacked for their valuables, we can infer why most of the loot in the carriages is, frankly, a bit rubbish. Constant war is a big theme of Elden Ring, and no doubt as the years drag on, the equipment any hero vaunted enough to get a funeral procession has is likely at the bottom of the barrel. We can also see this reflected in the emaciated congregation. None of the followers really have their wits about them, so degraded from life without death. I imagine before the shattering these carriages would have carried the greatest warriors and finest weapons, but those days are long gone, and any valiant guy with a flail is good enough for a funeral in the eyes of the zombified inhabitants. A lot of behaviour in Elden Ring has become routine, not because it serves a purpose, but rather because the people performing it have lost all awareness, and the funeral processions really hammer that home. I cannot pronounce the word processions. Processions. But we're not here to yap about the social costs of war, we're here for the economic costs. And these carriages have an important role to play in Marika's tax policy. See, runes are cool and all, but they're fickle and tend to be quite liquid, which is good for when you need to make regular purchases, but sometimes you want stable assets to invest in, and these carriages remind me of some ancient practices. A lot of wars in our ancient world were funded on the basis of plunder. The victorious force would pay its soldiers with captured treasure looted from enemy settlements. It was a big part of Roman propaganda to parade this treasure around, particularly in triumphs, where the treasure that didn't go to reimbursing soldiers was put on display for the citizens of Rome to see. Eventually, it would make its way into the treasury and enrich Rome and other societies like it. To me, the carriages serve that purpose pretty much to a T. While they haul the dead body of someone inside them, they also act as great vehicles of war propaganda, and given many carriages are seen heading towards Altus, it could be surmised that they're heading for Leyndell's treasury. But why? Well, assets hold value really well. Take the US Federal Reserve, for example. There's a good reason the US government hoards gold. It has historically maintained an increase in value over time. Money is fluid and prone to economic shock, but physical assets are much more resistant and tend to bounce back, where money usually depreciates in value over time. To stave off further rune inflation, storing captured and recovered treasure from the Golden Order's many wars is a pragmatic way of shoring up the economy and potentially rearming soldiers in the future. The reason most of the loot in these carriages is pretty poor is likely to do with what I mentioned about the declining quality of everything, with the dead heroes reduced to using any old beating stick. There's also the hold-up at the Altus carriage site we need to talk about that's crawling with omens. If part of Marika's tax policy is based on the spoils of war to fund and rearm her armies, having the carriages be intercepted is going to cause a lot of problems financially. Clearly, they keep piling up here, and whether it's because they came through here or got rerouted, it can't be good for the economy. While runes are clearly the most important aspect of Marika's tax policy, having a backup is always useful for a regime that is so prone to economic shock. And speaking of war, let's get to where everything went wrong. How the Lands Between's economy collapsed. Even before the shattering, Elden Ring's economy bears all the hallmarks of something that was set up to fail. Starting with the Age of Plenty during the Erdtree's early years, the overabundance of gifts from the tree gave burgeoning Erdtree society too much reliance on the tree. When this physical bounty started to diminish, the rot set in to the Golden Order. Like a spoiled child, given everything they could ever want, Erdtree society grew up with a chip on its shoulder, believing that it deserved anything and everything, and if the tree would no longer provide, then other cultures would. The Erdtree went from a source of sustenance to an object of devotion, and came to justify many terrible things in the name of spreading its influence. This period of jealous expansion probably lasted a long time, and as the Golden Order grew in power, it would have encountered rune inflation. More runes enter the economy, presumably from the conquered peoples, and the value of runes diminishes. Perhaps Marika bestowed more grace to certain people to help alleviate this, and it only spurred it on. Much like how we see inflation ravage the Roman Empire in the crisis of the 3rd century, as its money was debased by watering down the precious metal content. Social mobility would have been very hard in the Golden Order too. To have favour with the capital, you had to be in the capital, and we can see by the grand lifts of Dectus and Rold that travelling around land wasn't easy. There could have been far more medallions in the past, but the fact that today we find castles jealously guarding just halves of lift medallions shows how treasured they are, and Marika would probably not want to just hand them out. No mere peasant was going to travel from Limgrave to Altus, so if you were born down there, you're probably going to live your life down there forever, which is very accurate to the feudal system then. I'm not sure exactly when the nomadic merchants were rounded up, but their persecution and the Golden Order's unwillingness to trade in anything but runes would have led to a more closed-off market economy, where capital and goods from outside the land wouldn't be easy to trade. The lack of merchants would have reduced the supply and variety of goods, forcing the Golden Order to rely more on limited resources of its own land. This kind of treatment also extended to exiling those deemed unfit or unworthy, and the Golden Order did not take kindly to strangers coming in either. Marika divesting Godfrey and his warriors of grace and banishing them would have caused some unintentional capital flight, as we have gathered that even graceless Tarnished still seemed to possess their runes. With less money in the economy, and runes coalescing in fewer and fewer powerful beings, the lands would enter late-stage rune capitalism. Larger-than-life lords could prey on the small without fear, and the might makes right economy would rapidly spiral out of control. With no social welfare programs to point to, the weakest and most numerous in society would be further impoverished. To make matters worse, the supplementary measures of taxation and economic stimulus would come under threat. We can't know if or when efforts to farm the land started failing, but the inability to properly farm would shrink the economy and population. At some point too, either pre or post shattering, the Carriages bringing heirlooms and plunder to the Lanedale treasury would be regularly attacked for their valuables, robbing the capital of a steady stream of valuable assets. As the rune economy spiraled, productivity slumped, and the Lanedale vaults ran out of assets, the shattering would loom, and the biggest rune holders of them all, the demigods, would fight over the scraps of Marika's kingdom. The lands between, if not already neglected, would be ravaged by wars without the economic strength to restore them. With the rune of death long sealed away, over time, the feudal vassals of the various squabbling lords would become almost completely unproductive. If the lands between wasn't already dangerous prior to the shattering, then this would seal its fate, giving roads over to bandits, demi-human tribes, vengeful Albinorics, rampaging mercenaries, and all sorts of wild creatures, making travel and trade very difficult. To cap it all off, the discontent between Marika and Radagon that led to the shattering would have taken out the 3-in-1 Queen Pope banker extraordinaire that was Marika, locking her away in the Erdtree with no guidance or instruction, leaving the lands between's economy to finally go out with a bang. After the shattering, the demigods would seclude themselves and their followers, being either too weak to fight or far too obsessed with their own insane goals to heed Lanedale anymore, taking their runes out of circulation and dooming the economy for good. In retrospect, though it boasted many works of incredible engineering and construction, the Golden Order's economy was, quite frankly, pathetic. It had the power of God and anime on its side, yet it couldn't rise above the feeling that it deserved a level of luxury, abundance, and power so unsustainable it burnt itself out. If you believe the divine tower tree theory as I do, then you may believe that Marika stifled the growth of secondary Erdtrees, which could have created a more egalitarian system not dominated by one single tree. That would have yielded a less centrally dominated society that would have been less powerful, but possibly longer lasting. But when is it ever in the nature of gods or men to share power when it can be concentrated in themselves, no matter the consequences? And that's everything I have to say about Marika's tax policy and how it crushed the lands between's economy. You might not agree with everything or anything, but if you made it this far, sincerely, thank you. I want to make this channel really grow, so please like, comment and subscribe, and check out the Patreon if you want to support me. This video went on far too long and I need a break. See ya!